When a billionaire accustomed to buying respect humiliates a waitress in public, he has no idea that single moment will destroy his reputation and save his soul. Caught between headlines, public judgment, and a viral video, Ethan Cole discovers that the power that truly matters isn't his money, but the courage to face his own reflection and change before it's too late. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and ring the notification bell, because this is where you'll experience the most powerful stories on YouTube, and this one is going to really get to you. Ethan Cole didn't walk the streets of Manhattan. He owned them, with the silent authority of a man who signs contracts without reading the fine print, certain the world would bend to his terms. At 38, he was the flawless face of American tech innovation, the founder of Cole Innovations, a company with a market cap exceeding $8 billion, and a name that echoed in boardrooms from Tokyo to London as a synonym for disruption and relentless ambition. His office occupied the 43rd floor of a smoked glass skyscraper in the heart of Midtown, a space where silence was broken only by the metallic click of keyboards and the calculated murmur of assistants speaking in corporate code, a cold language of metrics, optimization, and leveraging value. Ethan wore custom-tailored Italian suits, sported a limited-edition Swiss watch that cost more than most people earned in a year, and his laugh, that dry, sharp, almost surgical sound, was known in every circle of power as the prelude to someone losing something. He didn't laugh out of joy but out of dominance, like a man marking his territory without raising his voice. His routine was a sequence of strategic meetings, lunches with investors in restaurants where the menus had no prices, and dinners at private clubs where access depended less on money and more on lineage. Ethan Cole believed in one unshakable truth: everything and everyone had a price, and those who denied it were simply too naive to admit their own insignificance. He had no time for the frivolity of romantic love, nor for the moral weight of consequences. His life was a chess game played on invisible boards, where every move was calculated to expand his empire and solidify his name as a synonym for undisputed success. On that June evening, he was seated at the head table of the Silver Crown, a luxury restaurant frequented by New York's financial elite, a place where crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like tamed constellations, and the silence was as expensive as the French wine served in baccarat crystal glasses. Ethan was surrounded by partners, investors, and executives, men and women whose laughter was studied, whose gestures were rehearsed, and who watched him with the nervous deference of those who know a single wrong word could cost them their career. The conversation revolved around hostile takeovers, strategic mergers, and growth projections, and Ethan commanded the table with the ease of a conductor leading an orchestra whose score he had written himself. Then, amidst the controlled murmur of the elite, a young waitress approached the table, carrying a silver tray with a bottle of red wine that cost over $1,500. Lily Turner was 26, with brown hair tied in a discreet bun, an impeccable black uniform, and a posture that blended elegance with a quiet humility that made no apologies for its existence. Her eyes were light brown, observant, and held a latent intelligence that no one in that room would bother to notice, because to the patrons of the Silver Crown, people like Lily were part of the decor, invisible until they made a mistake. And that is exactly what happened. As she poured the wine into Ethan's glass, Lily's hand trembled imperceptibly, perhaps from the tension in the room, perhaps from the exhaustion of a double shift, and a few drops of wine spilled over the rim of the glass, lightly staining the white Belgian linen tablecloth. The silence that followed was instantaneous, a social vacuum where every eye turned to the mistake as if it were a capital crime. Ethan watched the red stain spread slowly across the fabric, then raised his eyes to Lily with an expression that mixed cruel amusement and calculated contempt. "Interesting," he said, his voice cutting through the air with the precision of a blade. "I always thought serving wine was one of the few things that didn't require a Harvard degree. But perhaps I'm being overly optimistic about the level of competence required at this establishment." The table erupted in nervous laughter, forced chuckles that sounded more like submission than genuine humor. Ethan continued, leaning back slightly in his chair, his fingers steepled on the table like a judge about to pronounce a sentence. "Maybe we should create a training program for waitresses. Something simple, basic. I don't want to overdo it. Just enough so they can learn the difference between serving wine and pouring it like they're at a roadside dive bar." More laughter. Lily remained motionless, her face serene, with no trace of shame or anger, only a disconcerting calm that Ethan couldn't interpret. He expected tears, stammered apologies, perhaps even a hasty retreat to the kitchen, but Lily simply met his gaze, and in her eyes was something he wasn't accustomed to finding: poise. Then, in a soft, clear voice, utterly devoid of fear, Lily spoke. "You're right, Mr. Cole. Serving wine doesn't require a Harvard degree. But recognizing the difference between intelligence and arrogance, perhaps that does. The air in the room froze. The smiles vanished. Ethan blinked, processing what he had just heard as Lily continued, her voice maintaining the same professional, almost pedagogical tone. You quoted Nietzsche earlier when speaking about power and will. But the phrase you used isn't from Nietzsche. It's from Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer wasn't talking about dominating others. He was talking about mastering oneself. Absolute silence. Lily leaned over slightly, took a clean napkin, and delicately blotted the wine stain from the tablecloth, as if correcting a minor error in a lesson already learned. My apologies for the stain, sir. I hope the rest of your dinner proves more enlightening. She turned and walked away, leaving behind a table of stunned billionaires and a man whose laughter had been disarmed for the first time in years. Ethan Cole, the undisputed king of Manhattan, had just been schooled by someone he considered invisible, and the humiliation burned hotter than any spilled wine ever could. What happened in the minutes following that philosophical correction would forever change the trajectory of Ethan Cole, because the wounded pride of a powerful man is a wound that doesn't heal in silence. It bleeds publicly, demanding either revenge or redemption. Ethan remained motionless for 3 full seconds, long enough for every person at that table to realize that something extraordinary and dangerous had just occurred. The king had been challenged in his own territory, and not by an equal, but by someone who, in the eyes of the social hierarchy, shouldn't even have a voice. He felt the heat rise up his neck, a wave of humiliation crashing against the icy wall of his self-confidence, and the internal tension manifested in a forced smile, the kind of smile that precedes corporate tempests and summary dismissals. Owen Parker, his partner and longtime friend, cleared his throat uncomfortably, while the other guests exchanged furtive glances, unsure whether they should laugh, defend Ethan, or simply pretend nothing had happened. But Ethan didn't allow the silence to stretch. He never allowed silence to define him. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers interlaced like a professor about to correct a particularly stubborn student, and his voice emerged low, controlled, laden with a venomous irony he had perfected over years of destroying competitors in boardrooms. Schopenhauer, he repeated, savoring each syllable as if tasting a bitter wine. Impressive, truly impressive. So tell me, since you seem to have so much philosophical knowledge hidden behind that apron, what exactly is your academic background? Where did you study to become an expert on 19th century German authors while serving wine in a restaurant? The question was wrapped in contempt, a verbal trap designed to expose Lily as an imposter, a waitress who had likely read a few quotes online and now thought herself intellectually superior. Ethan expected fumbling, stammering, perhaps a humble confession that she was just repeating something she'd heard somewhere. But Lily stopped, turned slowly, and the look she gave Ethan held no anger or defensiveness. It was a look of pure clarity, as if she could see through the layers of arrogance and vanity to the void he was hiding. Harvard, Mr. Cole, she replied with the same unwavering calm. Philosophy and economics. 3 full years before I had to drop out. Not for lack of ability, but out of necessity. My brother has leukemia, and someone had to work to pay for his treatment. So yes, I know the difference between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. And I also know the difference between a man who earned his power through merit and one who uses it to compensate for what he can't buy. The impact was immediate and devastating. Lily's words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, visible, toxic, impossible to ignore. Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the ice of vulnerability, the feeling of control slipping through his fingers like wet sand. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came, because for the first time, he had no ready answer, no argument that could restore his authority without sounding even more pathetic. Lily inclined her head slightly, an almost reverent gesture, and then walked away toward the kitchen, leaving behind a table of silent billionaires and a man whose empire of certainties had just suffered its first crack. Owen was the first to break the silence, forcing an uncomfortable laugh and muttering something about poorly trained staff and a lack of professionalism. But no one laughed with him. They all knew that what had just happened wasn't a matter of professional etiquette. It was a matter of truth. And truth, when spoken with surgical precision, has the power to dismantle empires built on illusion. Ethan Cole, the man who never lost, had just lost something far more valuable than an argument. He had lost the illusion of invincibility, and the woman who had shattered it didn't wear a designer suit or command a boardroom. She wore a black apron and carried a tray, proving that real power was never where he thought it was. In the back of the Silver Crown, far from the crystal chandeliers and Belgian linen, Lily Turner leaned against the cold storeroom wall, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling that was beginning to spread through her hands. Not from fear, but from pure adrenaline, the chemical rush of someone who had just crossed an invisible line and knew there was no turning back. She hadn't planned to confront Ethan Cole, hadn't rehearsed those words, but when she heard the cruel laughter echoing across the room and felt the eyes of every guest on her as if she were an insect to be catalogued and dismissed, something inside her refused to stay silent. Lily knew that moment would cost her dearly. Maybe her job, maybe her reputation, maybe even the chance to get another job in any restaurant in Manhattan, because men like Ethan Cole didn't forget insults, much less public humiliation. But as her heart still pounded in her chest, she felt something stronger than fear, the unexpected sensation of reclaimed dignity, as if for a brief, fleeting moment, she had stopped being invisible and had become real. Maria Santos, the restaurant manager, entered the storeroom with brisk steps and a tense face, her lips pressed into a thin line that promised nothing good. "Lily, what the hell were you thinking? Do you know who that man is? Ethan Cole isn't just a customer. He owns half the investors who finance this place. If he wants to, he can destroy this restaurant's reputation with a single social media post." Maria's voice trembled between anger and panic, and Lily opened her eyes, facing the manager with the same unwavering calm she had used in the dining room. "I know who he is, Maria, and now he knows who I am too." Maria shook her head in disbelief and left the storeroom, muttering something about young idealists and consequences, leaving Lily alone again with her thoughts. Across town, inside a black Mercedes-Benz sedan gliding silently through the illuminated streets of Manhattan, Ethan Cole remained in absolute silence, his face turned to the tinted window, his eyes fixed on the city lights streaking by like stars in motion. Owen Parker, sitting beside him, tried to fill the void with casual conversation, remarking on the meal, on the impressive numbers from the last quarter, on the meeting scheduled for the next morning with Japanese investors. But Ethan didn't respond. His mind was trapped in that moment at the restaurant, replaying Lily Turner's words on a loop. Harvard, philosophy and economics. A brother with leukemia. The distinction between earned power and compensatory power. Each word was a splinter driven into Ethan's pride, and the more he tried to ignore them, the deeper they embedded themselves. He knew this kind of pain, the sting of a bruised ego, but this time was different. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a poisoned curiosity, a compulsive need to understand who this woman was, and how someone in her position could possess such moral and intellectual clarity. Owen finally registered the prolonged silence and turned to Ethan with a look of calculated concern. "You want me to take care of it? I can make a few calls, make sure she doesn't work anywhere decent in Manhattan again. It's the least we can do after that disrespect." Ethan turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Owen's with an icy intensity that made his partner flinch instinctively. "No," Ethan said, his voice low and controlled. "Don't do anything. Not yet." Owen frowned, confused, but nodded, knowing better than to question Ethan when he used that tone. The car stopped in front of Ethan's Upper East Side residential building, a glass and steel tower where each apartment cost upwards of $15 million. And he got out without a word of goodnight, heading straight up to his 52nd floor penthouse. The space was vast and minimalist, decorated with contemporary artworks that cost fortunes but had no soul, Italian designer furniture that looked more like sculptures than places to sit, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, lit up like an empire of infinite possibilities. Ethan poured himself a 30-year-old single malt scotch, sat in a leather armchair that had cost over $20,000, and for the first time in years, felt small in his own space. He picked up his phone and typed her name into the search bar, Lily Turner, and within seconds, found fragments of her digital life, an outdated academic profile from Harvard, a fundraising campaign for leukemia treatment that had raised less than $5,000, an old photo where she was smiling next to a thin, pale boy who could only be her brother. Ethan zoomed in on the image, studying her face, the way her smile reached her eyes, the authenticity he had long forgotten how to recognize. He closed the phone and downed the scotch in one gulp, feeling the liquid burn his throat like a necessary purification. Meanwhile, Lily finished her shift, changed out of her uniform into faded jeans and a simple jacket, and walked 20 minutes to the small Brooklyn apartment she shared with her brother Noah. The place was modest, 2 cramped bedrooms, second-hand furniture, thin walls that let in the sound of the neighbors. But it was home, and Lily entered quietly so as not to wake Noah, who was asleep in the next room, connected to a portable monitor that registered his vitals in cold, impersonal numbers. She made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened a book by Schopenhauer she'd borrowed from the public library. Not by coincidence, but because those ideas about will, suffering, and dignity helped her bear the weight of a life that demanded more from her than it should. Lily knew the confrontation with Ethan Cole would have consequences, but as she sipped her tea and read about the nature of human existence, she felt something rare and precious, the certainty that some battles are worth fighting, even when you know you might lose everything. 3 days after the incident at the Silver Crown, Ethan Cole did something he had never done in his entire meteoric career. He canceled 2 important meetings, ignored 17 calls from investors, and spent the entire afternoon at the New York Public Library, sitting at one of the dark wood reading tables, surrounded by volumes of German philosophy he hadn't opened since his college years, back when he still believed knowledge served a purpose beyond competitive advantage. He tried to convince himself he was there out of intellectual curiosity, to confirm that Lily Turner was wrong, that he hadn't confused Nietzsche with Schopenhauer, that her public correction had been nothing more than luck or the rote memorization of someone who had read online summaries. But as he turned the yellowed pages of The World as Will and Representation, finding passages underlined by anonymous readers of the past, Ethan began to realize something disturbing. She was right, completely right, and he had spent the last 15 years quoting phrases out of context to impress people who would never dare correct him. The discovery wasn't just humiliating, it was revealing. An unexpected mirror showing that the man he had built was a glittering facade built on a fragile foundation. It was in that moment, between dusty shelves and the library's reverent silence, that Ethan spotted Lily. She was sitting at a table near the economics section, surrounded by open books and notepads covered in her small, precise handwriting, her reading glasses sliding slightly down her nose as she transcribed something with a concentration so absolute she seemed oblivious to the world around her. Ethan watched her for several long minutes, noticing details he'd never perceived in the restaurant. The way she bit her lower lip when she encountered a complex idea, the unconscious gesture of twirling a strand of hair around her finger while she thought, the serenity that emanated from her, as if she were immune to the city's chaos outside. There was a quiet dignity to Lily that Ethan couldn't name, something that transcended social class or formal education. It was authenticity, the rare quality of someone who didn't need to pretend to be anything other than what she was. He approached slowly, his heart beating with an anxiety he hadn't felt since the early days of his startup, when every meeting could mean salvation or collapse. "So this is where you come when you're not correcting arrogant billionaires," Ethan said, keeping his voice low to respect the setting, but with a tone that tried for casual and failed miserably. Lily looked up, and for a split second, Ethan saw genuine surprise on her face before she recomposed her mask of professional calm. "Mr. Cole," she replied, slowly closing her book as if marking the end of an important chapter. "I didn't expect to see you in a place where knowledge doesn't have a market price." The jab was subtle but piercing, and Ethan felt the sting even as he admired the precision of the attack. He pulled out a chair and sat down without asking permission, a gesture he recognized as invasive even as he did it. "I came to apologize," he said, and hearing the words leave his own mouth, he realized it was true, not the whole truth, because part of him still wanted to reclaim control of the narrative, but a bigger truth than anything he had admitted in years. "What I said that night was cruel, unnecessary, and factually wrong. You were right about Schopenhauer, and about me." Lily tilted her head slightly, studying him with those light brown eyes that seemed capable of reading every layer of artifice he tried to construct. "And you came all the way here to tell me that? Or did you come here to feel better about yourself?" The question cut deep, exposing the ambiguity of his own motives, and Ethan had to fight the instinct to defend himself with polished rhetoric. "Honestly, I don't know, maybe both. But I also came because you asked me a question that night, without even using words. You made me ask what exactly I've accomplished, and if being worth $8 billion means anything when you're worth nothing as a human being." The silence that followed was thick and charged, and Lily closed her notebook, setting her pen aside with deliberate care. "You know what's funny, Mr. Cole? You think power is dominating a room, making people laugh at your jokes even when they're not funny, having an army of lawyers and assistants who solve your problems before you even realize they exist. But real power is being able to sleep at night, knowing you didn't destroy anyone to get where you are. It's looking in the mirror and recognizing the person looking back. Have you tried doing that lately?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer would be too devastating to admit out loud. Instead, he looked at the books on her table, treatises on modern economic theory, studies on income inequality, analyses of public health policy, and realized that while he spent his days optimizing profit algorithms, Lily spent her nights trying to understand how to save the world, one concept at a time. "I want to hire you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could censor them, impulsive and raw. Not as a waitress, as a consultant. My company needs someone who thinks like you, who asks the hard questions, who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Lily stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something unexpected. She laughed, a low, genuine laugh that sounded more sad than amused. You really don't get it, do you? I don't want to work for you. I don't want to be tamed, turned into another voice that validates your decisions while you carry on exactly as you've always been. You don't need a consultant, Mr. Cole. You need a mirror, and I'm not generous enough to be that mirror for free. She gathered her books, packed them into the worn bag she carried, and stood to leave. But before she went, she turned one last time, and the look she gave Ethan held something new. Not contempt, but compassion. The dangerous kind of compassion that sees through all defenses and recognizes the pain hidden beneath. When you're ready to truly change, not out of guilt or a bruised ego, but because you finally understood that life has more value than your bank account, maybe then we can have a real conversation. Until then, good luck with your books, Mr. Cole. Schopenhauer is tough, but you'll need something stronger than philosophy to heal what's broken in you. So, what Ethan Cole hadn't anticipated, and what no billionaire accustomed to controlling narratives through PR departments and corporate influence could ever predict, was the viral power of an authentic moment captured on video and shared by millions of strangers hungry for social justice. One of the guests at the Silver Crown that night, a young financial analyst named Marcus Chen, who worked for a rival investment fund, had recorded the entire confrontation between Ethan and Lily on his smartphone, initially for private entertainment. But after witnessing her surgical response, he decided the world deserved to see one of Wall Street's most arrogant men intellectually dismantled by a waitress. The video was posted to Twitter with the caption, "Arrogant billionaire learns the difference between power and wisdom," and within 48 hours, it had amassed over 12 million views, 30,000 comments, and had been shared by influential figures ranging from social activists to university professors, all celebrating Lily as a symbol of resistance against the out-of-touch elite. Ethan Cole's face, frozen in the exact moment his expression shifted from arrogance to humiliation, became an instant meme, replicated in dozens of variations with cruel captions labeling him the dethroned king, fragile billionaire, and the man who discovered money can't buy dignity. But it was Lily who suffered the most immediate and tangible consequences of this unwilling exposure. The morning after the video went viral, Maria Santos called her into the restaurant's office, a small, windowless room that smelled of old paper and stale coffee, and with a face marked by a mixture of pity and inevitability, informed her that the Silver Crown could no longer keep her on staff. It's not about incompetence, Lily. You know that. But half of our clients are people like Ethan Cole, and they don't want to be served by someone who's become a symbol of resistance against them. It's a matter of business survival. The explanation was wrapped in corporate apologies, but the message was clear. Dignity doesn't pay the bills, and Lily had just learned that challenging power has a price. She left the restaurant without drama, tears, or protests, only with the cold awareness that she had made the right choice at the wrong time, and now she would have to find a way to survive in a city that celebrated her courage online but punished her for it economically in real life. In the following days, Lily applied for 17 different positions: waitress, receptionist, administrative assistant, anything that would pay enough to cover the rent and Noah's medications. But every interview ended the same way. The hiring manager would recognize her face from the viral video, and the conversation would instantly cool, replaced by empty promises of, "We'll be in touch," that never materialized. She had discovered that fame without fortune is just exposure without protection, and that the internet celebrates temporary heroes but abandons them when the cameras turn off. It was Owen Parker who brought Ethan the first reputational impact analyses, walking into his office with a tablet loaded with graphs showing the drop in Cole Innovation's public approval rating, the spike in negative social media mentions, and the 3 partner companies that had requested meetings to reassess the alignment of values, corporate code for a veiled threat to sever contracts. "You've become the villain of the week, Ethan," Owen said, bluntly, a privilege afforded to him by their 20-year friendship. "And it's not just an image problem. Investors are worried you're unstable, that the incident is a symptom of something larger. We need damage control, immediately." Ethan listened in silence, his fingers drumming lightly on the tempered glass desk, his eyes fixed on the numbers that quantified his humiliation in corporate metrics. Part of him wanted to follow the traditional script, issue a public apology, make a generous donation to some education-related charity, maybe even appear in a TV interview where he would demonstrate calculated vulnerability and personal growth. But another part, the part that had been born in that library, watching Lily study with a devotion he hadn't felt for anything in years, knew that performing repentance would be just another form of lying, and that Lily would see through the charade instantly. "Find her," Ethan said suddenly, cutting Owen off mid-sentence in a proposal for a communication strategy. "Lily Turner, find out if she's still working, where she is, what she needs, and don't send anyone from legal or HR. I'll go myself." Owen blinked, processing the instruction with the look of someone watching a friend drive the wrong way down a one-way street. "Are you serious?" "Ethan, approaching her now will look like intimidation, or worse, like you're trying to buy her silence. The press will crucify you." But Ethan was already on his feet, grabbing his coat. The decision crystallized in his mind with a clarity that surprised even him. "Then let them crucify me. I'm already the villain of the story, Owen. Maybe it's time to stop managing perceptions and start fixing real mistakes." 2 days later, Ethan found Lily not through private investigators or corporate reports, but through the simplest, most human method possible. He went back to the public library at the same time he had seen her before, and she was there again, at the same table, surrounded by the same books, as if it were her refuge from a world that both celebrated and punished her. He approached slowly, aware that every step was laden with meaning, and when Lily looked up and saw him, there was no surprise on her face, only a kind of weary resignation, as if she already knew this confrontation was inevitable. "I know you lost your job because of me," Ethan said, skipping the preliminaries because he knew Lily had no patience for social games. "And I know no decent place will hire you as long as you're known as the waitress who humiliated Ethan Cole. So I'm here to make you an offer. Not a corporate job offer or disguised charity. A real proposal. Work with me, not for me. Help me rebuild my company based on something other than profit. And in return, I will ensure your brother receives the best medical treatment available, no debt, no strings attached. It's not redemption, it's just the beginning of trying to do the right thing." Lily studied him for several long seconds, her eyes scanning every nuance of his expression for manipulation or artifice, and then she closed the book she was reading, this time a treatise on business ethics, and crossed her arms on the table. "If I accept this, it's not because I believe in you, Mr. Cole. It's because my brother needs to live, and I've learned that survival sometimes requires alliances with people you'd rather avoid. But know this, I won't be tamed. I won't pretend you're better than you are. And if you try to turn me into another decorative piece in your empire, I will destroy you as easily as I destroyed your arrogance in that restaurant. Are we clear?" Ethan extended his hand, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt that a handshake meant something more than a contract. Perfectly clear. Lily Turner's first strategic meeting at Cole Innovations took place on a rainy Friday in July, in the 43rd floor conference room, a space designed to intimidate with its transparent glass walls, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan, and its long Italian marble table, where million-dollar decisions were made with the same casualness that ordinary people chose dinner. Ethan had summoned the company's 5 senior executives, including Owen Parker, CFO Sharon Mills, VP of Operations David Huang, Head of HR Patricia Lawson, and CTO Marcus Rivera, and announced bluntly that Lily would be a strategic consultant for corporate ethics, a title he had invented on the spot that sounded vague enough not to threaten established hierarchy, but important enough to ensure she would have a voice in crucial decisions. The reaction was predictable. Polite smiles that masked thinly veiled contempt, exchanged glances that silently communicated, "How long until she realizes she's out of her depth?" and a courteous coldness that turned corporate welcomes into veiled rejection. Sharon Mills, a 52-year-old woman with a Stanford MBA and 3 decades of experience in corporate finance, was the first to test the waters. "No offense, Ms. Turner, but what exactly is your experience in strategic consulting? Because running an $8 billion company requires a little more than a theoretical knowledge of philosophy." The question was wrapped in professional condescension, and Lily, sitting at the opposite end of the table in a simple blazer she had bought at a department store with the first advance Ethan had deposited in her account, showed no sign of intimidation. "My experience, Ms. Mills, comes from 3 years of watching how wealthy people treat invisible people. It comes from understanding that every corporate decision has a human face on the other side. Someone who loses their job when you optimize costs. Someone who can't afford medical treatment when you cut health benefits to increase profit margins by 2%. So no, I don't have an MBA, but I have something none of you seem to have, an awareness of the human cost of the spreadsheets you approve." The silence that followed was thick and hostile, and Ethan, observing the dynamic from the head of the table, felt something strange happening in his chest, pride mixed with fear, because he knew he had invited not a consultant, but a revolutionary into the system he had built. David Huang, trying to ease the tension with pragmatism, shifted the focus to the meeting's topic. The proposal to acquire a smaller startup called Vital Health, a medical tech company that had developed an affordable health monitoring app for low-income communities. The acquisition made financial sense. Vital Health had valuable intellectual property and a growing user base, but the integration plan drafted by Ethan's team involved discontinuing the affordable pricing model and repositioning the product for the premium market, where profit margins were substantially higher. It's a basic value maximization strategy, Owen explained, pointing to the graphs projected on the screen, numbers that danced in ascending columns promising a 300% return on investment in 18 months. The low-income market simply doesn't generate enough revenue to justify the operational costs. By moving to the premium segment, we turn a marginal business into a significant profit center. Lily listened in silence, her eyes scanning the documents she'd been given. And then, with a calmness that belied the gravity of what she was about to say, she spoke. You're essentially proposing to kill a company that saves lives to create another that profits from privilege. Vital Health exists because 300,000 low-income Americans use this app to monitor diabetes, high blood pressure, and other chronic conditions that, without monitoring, lead to medical emergencies that cost the healthcare system billions of dollars annually. You want to take a tool of social justice and turn it into another luxury product for people who already have access to everything. And you call this a smart strategy? Patricia Lawson, the head of HR, sighed with calculated impatience. With all due respect, Lily, we're running a business, not a nonprofit. Business decisions need to be based on financial viability, not social sentimentality. It was then that Lily did something no one expected. She took out the laptop she had brought, connected it to the projector, and with precise movements, replaced Owen's financial graphs with a presentation she had prepared over the last 72 hours, working late into the night while Noah slept in the next room. The first image showed a heat map of the United States, highlighting low-income communities using Vital Health. The second showed statistics on the reduction of hospital admissions correlated with the app's use. The third presented an alternative financial model, which Lily had developed using public data and economic projections, demonstrating that maintaining the affordable model, expanding into international markets, and partnering with public health systems would generate not only social impact, but also sustainable long-term profitability, albeit lower than Owen's plan. Here's the difference between you and me, Lily said, her voice carrying an authority that transcended corporate credentials. You see numbers. I see my mother, who died from untreated diabetes because she couldn't afford insulin and proper monitoring. I see my brother, who is only alive because we were lucky enough to find doctors who still believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And I see 300,000 people you are proposing to condemn to an impossible choice: pay for an app they can't afford, or risk their lives without it. So yes, my plan generates less profit in the short term, but it doesn't turn you into corporate assassins disguised as business geniuses. The impact was seismic. Sharon Mills went pale. Marcus Rivera began double-checking Lily's figures on his tablet, and Owen looked at Ethan with an expression that pleaded for intervention, for a return to normalcy where decisions were made based on spreadsheets, not conscience. But Ethan remained silent, his eyes fixed on Lily, seeing in her something he had lost so long ago he couldn't even remember what it felt like. Moral courage? The willingness to sacrifice social approval for the sake of an inconvenient truth. David Huang, the most pragmatic person in the room, broke the silence with a genuine question. Assuming your model is correct, and I admit, the numbers look solid, how do you propose we convince our investors to accept lower returns? They didn't invest in coal innovations to fund a charity. Lily turned to him with a look that blended respect for the question with firmness in her response. You convince them by showing that companies built on exploitation eventually collapse when public opinion turns against them. You show them that ethical sustainability isn't charity, it's long-term risk management. And if they still resist, you find better investors. Because anyone who only cares about quarterly profits doesn't understand how to build legacies that survive for generations. Ethan, for the first time in the meeting, spoke, and his voice carried a resolution that surprised even him. We're implementing Lily's plan. We keep Vital Health affordable, expand according to her model, and present it to the investors as a long-term strategy with both financial and reputational returns. And if anyone in this room can't work with that vision, the door is open. Owen stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed like a rupture. You're making a mistake, Ethan. A mistake that's going to cost you dearly. And he walked out, leaving behind a room divided between those who saw Lily as a threat and those who, for the first time, were beginning to see that power without purpose is just well-dressed destruction. Ethan Cole's decision to implement Lily's ethical model triggered a chain reaction that exposed the hidden fractures in his corporate empire with the brutal precision of an earthquake, revealing geological faults that had always been there, just waiting for enough pressure to crack the surface. Owen Parker, who had left the meeting like a man abandoning a burning ship, spent the following weeks orchestrating a quiet campaign of internal resistance, meeting with key investors over discreet lunches at private clubs where non-disclosure was implicit and loyalties were traded like commodities. He argued in the cold language of numbers that Ethan was emotionally compromised, that Lily Turner's influence represented a fiduciary risk, that social sentimentality had no place in high-level corporate strategy, and that perhaps it was time for shareholders to consider a leadership restructuring before the company lost irreparable market value. Owen's words found fertile ground among investors who saw Ethan not as a visionary, but as a manageable asset, and the corporate conspiracy began to take shape, like vapor freezing into sharp crystals. Simultaneously, Lily's presence at Cole Innovations had become the focus of intense public scrutiny, fueled by a media that loved a corporate Cinderella story, but also couldn't resist the temptation to question the legitimacy of someone who had jumped from waitress to strategic consultant in a matter of weeks. Articles in financial publications dissected her credentials with the scalpel of doubt. Lily Turner, moral genius or skilled opportunist, was the headline in the Financial Observer, while the Tech Business Daily published a crueler piece titled, "When Virtue Signaling Replaces Real Competence," arguing that Ethan was using Lily as a PR shield rather than admitting his own leadership had been compromised by the viral scandal. The online comments were even more virulent, oscillating between fierce defense of Lily as a working-class hero and misogynistic attacks accusing her of manipulating Ethan through calculated seduction, as if it were inconceivable that a woman from a humble background could gain influence through sheer intellect. Lily read these critiques late at night, after returning to the Brooklyn apartment where Noah slept connected to the now state-of-the-art medical monitors funded by Ethan, and she felt the crushing weight of representing not just herself, but all the invisible people whose voices never reached corporate boardrooms. But it was the confrontation with Victoria Ashford, Ethan's ex-girlfriend and the heiress to a Manhattan real estate dynasty, that escalated the conflict into personal and dangerously emotional territory. Victoria appeared unannounced at Ethan's office one August afternoon, striding through the waiting area with the confidence of someone who never had to schedule meetings because doors always opened automatically for her last name and her glacial beauty. She was everything Lily was not: tall, blonde, educated in the finest European schools, fluent in 4 languages, and connected to every powerful family on the East Coast by blood or social ties. Victoria and Ethan had ended their relationship 6 months prior, a civilized parting between people who understood that love was secondary to social convenience, but she had never fully accepted that someone of Ethan Cole's caliber could exist outside her orbit. Upon finding Lily in the hallway, recognizing her immediately from the viral video all of Manhattan had seen, Victoria stopped, tilted her head with predatory curiosity, and spoke with the venomous sweetness of someone who had turned condescension into an art form. "So you're the famous Lily Turner, the waitress who became Ethan's moral guru. Fascinating. Tell me, how exactly does someone who spent the last few years waiting tables qualify to advise on billion-dollar corporate strategy? Or is the primary qualification here something else?" The attack was disguised as curiosity, but the insinuation was crystal clear. Lily was there not by merit, but by emotional or sexual manipulation. Lily, holding a folder of documents and wearing a simple dress that had cost $40 on sale, faced Victoria with the same unwavering calm she had used in the restaurant months before. "The qualification, Ms. Ashford, is that I know the difference between building something that lasts and maintaining appearances that crumble. Maybe if you'd spent less time worrying about who was standing next to Ethan, and more time understanding why he needed someone to challenge him instead of validate him, you'd still be standing there. But I suppose self-reflection isn't taught in the European schools you attended." Victoria smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, and she stepped close enough for only Lily to hear her next words. "You think you're changing him, but you're just entertaining a phase. Men like Ethan Cole always return to the world they came from, because it's the only world where they make sense. And when he gets tired of playing at moral redemption, you'll find that Cinderella always goes back to the cinders." The encounter ended with Victoria walking into Ethan's office and closing the door. And through the glass walls, Lily watched the conversation she couldn't hear, but whose content she could imagine. Victoria appealing to their shared history, to the social connections Ethan was risking, to the common sense that Lily was a dangerous distraction who needed to be removed before she caused irreparable harm. And for a terrible moment, Watching Ethan listen to Victoria with the neutral expression he used when processing difficult arguments, Lily felt the first real crack in her own conviction, the cold doubt that maybe she really was a temporary intruder in a world that would never fully accept her, no matter how many meetings she won or how many arguments she built. But it was that night, when Ethan found her still working in the empty office after everyone else had gone home, that the true nature of the conflict finally surfaced. He entered without knocking, carrying 2 cups of coffee he'd bought from the lobby cafe because he didn't know how to make coffee and had never needed to learn, and sat in the chair across from her desk with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from prolonged psychological warfare. "Victoria told me you're a mistake that will cost me my company, my reputation, and my future," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a vulnerability Lily had never heard before. "Owen sent me a 30-page presentation arguing that investors are considering selling their shares because they think I've lost focus. And my lawyer informed me there are rumors of a hostile takeover being organized by a consortium of shareholders who believe I've become a risk to the company's value." He paused, sipped his coffee, and then asked the question that would change everything. "Tell me honestly, Lily, am I destroying everything I've built for an illusion of redemption, or am I finally building something worthwhile?" Lily set her pen down, removed her reading glasses, and looked at Ethan with an intensity that forced him to hold her gaze, even when every instinct screamed to look away. "That's the wrong question, Ethan. The question isn't whether you're destroying what you built. The question is whether what you built deserved to exist in the first place. You created an empire based on maximizing profit without considering the human cost. You treated people like variables in financial equations. You laughed at waitresses and fired employees and made decisions that ruined lives because the numbers in your bank account were more real to you than the people on the other side of those decisions. So yes, what you built is crumbling. And maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe that's justice. But what you build now, with conscience and purpose, that could be a real legacy. The choice isn't between keeping the old empire or accepting ruin. The choice is between being the man you've always been or becoming the man you still can be." But the silence that followed was heavy with existential weight, and Ethan realized he was at a breaking point where every subsequent decision would define not only his career, but his fundamental identity as a human being. And for the first time in his life, the fear he felt was not of losing money or status, but of losing the one person who saw him for who he truly was and still believed he could be better. The extraordinary meeting of the Coal Innovations Board of Shareholders was called for a Monday in September in a conference room on the 18th floor of a corporate building in Lower Manhattan, far from the company's headquarters, as if the mere act of changing scenery could disguise the nature of what was about to happen. A corporate execution planned with the cold precision of surgery, where Ethan Cole would be forced to choose between maintaining control of the company he founded or continuing the path of moral transformation he had begun alongside Lily Turner. Owen Parker had orchestrated everything with the efficiency of a military strategist, gathering 7 of the company's 10 largest investors, presenting them with reports documenting the 6% drop in stock value since the implementation of Lily's ethical policies, projecting catastrophic scenarios where Coal Innovations would lose market share to less scrupulous competitors, and finally proposing a formal resolution. Either Ethan fire Lily and return to a management style focused on profit maximization, or the board would vote to remove him from his position as CEO and install Owen as his replacement, a move that would be publicly framed as a natural leadership transition, but that everyone in the room would understand as a corporate coup justified by numbers and legal precedent. Ethan received the summons the night before, reading the 23-page document that detailed all the reasons he had supposedly failed in his fiduciary duties, and for the first time since building his empire, he felt not the fear of loss, but a crystal clarity about what truly mattered. And he realized that everything he had achieved in the last 15 years could vanish in a 15-minute vote. And the only thing that genuinely terrified him wasn't losing the company, but losing the chance to prove that real change was possible. He didn't tell Lily about the meeting, not because he wanted to protect her, but because he knew she would insist on resigning to save his company. And that selflessness, that sacrifice she would make without hesitation, was the exact opposite of what he needed to learn. On the morning of the meeting, Ethan put on his best Armani suit, not as corporate armor, but as the uniform of a man attending his own trial with his dignity intact, and arrived at the conference room 15 minutes early, finding Owen already installed at the head of the table, surrounded by binders and tablets containing the documentary ammunition needed to justify the deposition. The investors arrived in succession. Margaret Chen, founder of a private equity fund that controlled 18% of the stock. Robert Kleinman, a retired tech mogul who had invested in Coal Innovations' early days, Sarah DuPont, heiress to a European banking fortune, and other faces Ethan knew from dinners and conferences, people who always smiled at him but whose loyalties were as liquid as the money they moved. The meeting began with Owen presenting the numbers with the artificial neutrality of someone reciting unquestionable facts. A drop in investor confidence, delays in lucrative projects diverted for social initiatives, rumors of corporate clients considering alternatives because coal innovations was becoming too political. Each argument was built on a partial truth, manipulated with the mastery of someone who understands that statistics can be more effective weapons than outright lies. Margaret Chen was the first to speak after the presentation, her voice carrying the coldness of someone who makes million-dollar decisions before breakfast. Ethan, no one here questions your vision or your talent. You built an extraordinary company. But leadership means knowing when to prioritize financial sustainability over idealistic experiments. Ms. Turner may have good intentions, but intentions don't pay dividends. Ethan listened to each argument in silence, observing the corporate ritual where his life's work would be reduced to performance metrics and profit projections. And then, when Owen finally presented the formal resolution, asking for his voluntary resignation or face a vote of removal, Ethan did something no one expected. He laughed, not the cruel laugh he used to dominate, but a genuine, almost liberating laugh of someone who finally sees the existential absurdity of a system he himself had helped create. "You know what's funny?" Ethan said, rising from his chair and walking to the window overlooking the East River, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders relaxed like a man who has already made an irrevocable decision. "I spent 15 years of my life building this company, 15 years waking up at 5 in the morning, working until midnight, sacrificing relationships and health and anything that didn't generate shareholder value. And you know what I got? An $8 billion valuation, an empty apartment overlooking Central Park, and a reputation as the kind of man who makes cruel jokes about waitresses to impress investors. Congratulations to us all. We built an empire on emptiness." He turned, facing everyone in the room, and his voice lost any trace of sarcasm, taking on the solemnity of a final confession. "Margaret, you said intentions don't pay dividends, but let me tell you a story about dividends. Lily Turner worked for 3 years as a waitress, double shifts, minimum wage, to pay for her brother's leukemia treatment. She dropped out of Harvard, not because she wasn't smart enough, but because she chose love over ambition. And when I publicly humiliated her, she didn't cry, she didn't sue me, she didn't try to capitalize on the viral fame. She just kept living with a dignity that none of us in this room has shown in decades. So you're right. Intentions don't pay dividends. But dignity pays something infinitely more valuable: the ability to look in the mirror and recognize a decent human being looking back." Robert Kleinman, a veteran of dozens of corporate battles, leaned forward, his fingers steepled on the table. "That's very moving, Ethan. But are you willing to lose everything you've built for this moral speech?" And Ethan replied with the clarity of someone who finally understands that some losses are victories in disguise. "I'm not losing anything worth keeping, Robert. You want to vote for my removal? Vote. You want to install Owen as CEO? Do it. But know that I'm going to walk out of here and create something new, something that doesn't depend on exploiting human vulnerability to generate profit. And I'm going to do it with Lily by my side, not as a subordinate consultant, but as an equal partner. Because she taught me that real power isn't in dominating boardrooms, it's in transforming lives. And if you can't see the value in that, then you've already lost something far more important than market share." Sarah DuPont, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke, her voice carrying genuine surprise. "You're really willing to abandon coal innovations? The company that is your name? Your identity?" Ethan picked up his coat, preparing to leave before the vote even began. And the answer he gave was not for Sarah, but for himself, a declaration of independence from a lifetime of distorted priorities. "My identity isn't a company. My identity is who I choose to be when no one is watching, when there's no profit to be extracted, when the only thing at stake is my own conscience. And I choose to be someone Lily Turner wouldn't be ashamed to know. Vote however you want. I've already made my choice." And he walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a stunned silence and an empire that suddenly seemed too small to contain the version of himself he was becoming. The news of Ethan Cole's departure from the company that bore his name exploded in the financial press with the devastating force of a corporate scandal no one had seen coming, instantly becoming headlines that ranged from "Billionaire resigns after ethical conflict" to "Cole abandons $8 billion empire in dramatic gesture." In the 48 hours that followed, as market analysts debated the financial implications and social commentators dissected the psychological motivations, Ethan experienced something he hadn't felt since the early days of his startup: the terrifying and simultaneously liberating vertigo of not knowing what would happen next. He spent 2 days isolated in his penthouse, ignoring the hundreds of calls from journalists, lawyers, and former allies who alternated between offering condolences and advising him to reverse his decision before the damage became irreparable. But it was only when Lily showed up unannounced, having gained access to the building through a combination of determination and the sympathy of a doorman who recognized her from the viral video, that Ethan realized he had crossed a psychological Rubicon, from which there was no return. She entered the apartment, taking in the space where he lived for the first time, and the look she gave the room, with its million-dollar abstract art, designer furniture that looked more like sculptures than functional objects, and a panoramic view of Manhattan stretching out like an illuminated empire, held not envy, but a comprehensive sadness, as if she could see through the luxury to the emptiness he had always tried to fill with material acquisitions. "You're an idiot," Lily said without preamble, standing in the center of the room while Ethan remained seated in the armchair where he had spent the last few hours stewing in the magnitude of his decision. "Not because you left the company, but because you left thinking this was about me, about proving something to me, about a performative redemption that still places you at the center of the narrative as a tragic hero. You don't understand anything." The accusation was so unexpected and brutal that Ethan stood up instinctively, defensiveness rising like a conditioned reflex. "I gave up everything I built. I lost billions in net worth, destroyed my reputation, burned bridges with every investor who ever supported me. And you're telling me I don't understand anything?" Lily took 2 steps toward him, and in her eyes was an intensity that transcended anger or gratitude. It was absolute moral clarity, the kind of truth that cuts through all rationalizations and exposes the bone of real motivation. "You didn't give up anything, Ethan. You were forced to choose between 2 versions of yourself, and you chose the one that would be less painful in the long run. But a forced choice isn't transformation. Transformation is when you wake up every day and actively choose to be different, even when no one is watching, even when there's no moral reward waiting at the end. Did you think I came here to thank you? To congratulate you on your noble sacrifice? I came to tell you that if you did this, hoping I would see you as a redeemed hero, you have completely failed to understand what I tried to teach you." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and Ethan felt something inside him break. Not the superficial pride Lily had shattered in the restaurant months ago, but something deeper and more fundamental, the last layer of protection between him and absolute vulnerability. "Then what do you want from me?" he asked, and his voice came out broken, stripped of all artifice. "What do I have to do to prove I'm not just performing transformation?" Lily took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice held not judgment, but a tough compassion, the kind of love that refuses to be gentle when the truth is necessary. "You don't prove anything, Ethan. You just live. You wake up tomorrow and you don't try to rebuild an empire. You don't launch a social startup to prove you've learned your lesson. You live small, simple, with no expectation of recognition. You help my brother not because it makes you feel redeemed, but because it's the right thing to do. You work without seeking applause. You learn to measure success not in numbers or headlines, but in the peace you feel when you lay your head on the pillow, knowing you didn't destroy anyone that day. And maybe, after years of doing that, you'll finally understand what it means to be a real human being." The silence that followed was dense with the weight of inescapable truth, and Ethan realized that Lily hadn't come here to save or celebrate him. She had come to break him completely, to ensure that the foundation upon which he would rebuild his life was solid enough to support the person he needed to become. It was at that moment that Lily's phone rang. Noah, the name flashing on the screen, and as she answered, Ethan saw her face change instantly from confrontation to pure fear, and she said, "I'm on my way," before hanging up with trembling hands. "Noah's in the hospital. His blood counts dropped. They need to do an emergency transfusion." She was already moving toward the door when Ethan caught up to her, grabbing his car keys, the Mercedes he hadn't driven in months because private drivers had always been more convenient, and said with a firmness that allowed no argument, "I'm driving. Let's go." The drive to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital was made in tense silence, Ethan navigating Manhattan's nighttime traffic with an urgency he had never felt driving to a business meeting, and when they arrived, they found Noah in the emergency room, hooked up to IV lines and monitors that beeped with the artificial regularity of life sustained by technology. Lily rushed to her brother's side, holding his hand with a tenderness that made Ethan realize all her talk of ethics and dignity were not philosophical abstractions. They were convictions born of tangible love, of nights spent in hospitals, of the fear of losing the only family she had left. The attending physician, Dr. Hassan, explained that the last round of chemotherapy had dangerously weakened Noah's immune system, that the transfusions would stabilize him temporarily, but that long-term treatment would require a bone marrow transplant, a procedure costing over $400,000 that public insurance only partially covered, leaving a $200,000 debt that Lily could never pay off even if she worked for a decade. Ethan, standing in the cold hospital corridor, watching Lily whisper words of comfort to Noah as silent tears streamed down her face, had an epiphany that came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a simple, devastating recognition. The richest person in that room wasn't him, with his evaporated but still substantial billions. It was Lily, who possessed something no amount of money had ever bought him: purpose derived from unconditional love. Without a word, Ethan left the hospital, took out his phone, and made 3 calls. First, to his wealth manager, instructing an immediate transfer of $500,000 to an account he would create for Noah's treatment. Second, to the top oncology specialist in New York, whom he knew from charity dinners and who agreed to evaluate Noah as a personal favor. Third, to the accountant who managed his investments, asking for an analysis of how to liquidate enough assets to create a permanent fund that would guarantee ongoing medical treatment, not only for Noah, but for 50 other patients in the same situation, young people whose lives depended on medications that cost more than their families earned in years. When he returned to the emergency room 2 hours later, Noah was stable and asleep, and Lily was waiting for him in the hallway, her eyes red but dry. When Ethan told her what he had done, she didn't thank him, didn't weep with gratitude. She just hugged him, a long, silent embrace that communicated something deeper than words ever could. An acknowledgement that he had finally understood that redemption isn't a grand gesture, but a quiet commitment to fixing what was broken, one life at a time. 6 months after that night in the hospital, Ethan Cole was living in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, a 2-bedroom space in a building with no doorman, where the elevator made a strange noise, and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' conversations, but which cost $1,800 a month instead of the $25,000 he had paid for the penthouse he'd sold along with most of his material assets. He woke up at 6 in the morning not for strategic meetings, but to volunteer at a community financial literacy center in Crown Heights, teaching low-income youth about investing, economic planning, and how to navigate banking systems designed to exclude them. The irony of using knowledge he had once applied to accumulate wealth to now democratize access to it was not lost on him, but neither did it bother him. It was exactly the kind of productive contradiction Lily had insisted was essential for real growth. Noah had gone into remission after a successful bone marrow transplant, a procedure fully funded by the medical trust Ethan had established, which had already benefited 43 other patients. Watching Noah regain his strength, return to his studies, and talk about his plans to become a biomedical engineer was more gratifying to Ethan than any corporate acquisition had ever been, because it was a tangible result that didn't disappear after the market closed or with shifts in quarterly valuations. Lily had accepted a position as the executive director of the Horizons Foundation, a nonprofit Ethan had created with a significant portion of his remaining fortune, focused on providing education and opportunities for talented youth from marginalized communities, and working alongside her in this capacity, not as a boss but as an equal collaborator, taught Ethan that true partnership required leaving his ego at the door and accepting that sometimes the best contribution he could make was to be silent and listen. Cole Innovations, under Owen Parker's leadership, had continued to operate on the old model of profit maximization, and its stock had recovered some of its lost value, proving to investors that their concerns were justified. But 3 months after the transition, a scandal erupted when investigative journalists discovered the company had sold private user data to advertisers without proper consent, an ethical breach Owen had personally approved to generate $20 million in additional revenue. Watching the company that once bore his name get fined $800 million and face class action lawsuits was both vindicating and saddening for Ethan, because it proved Lily had been right about the inevitable consequences of prioritizing profit over dignity. But it also confirmed that the corporate system he had helped perpetuate would continue to destroy human values until people like Lily had real power to change it. Victoria Ashford had sent a text months after Ethan's departure, asking if he wanted to have dinner to reconnect. But he had politely declined, realizing that the woman he had once considered an ideal partner was simply incompatible with the person he was becoming, and that relationships built on shared status crumble when status is no longer the foundation of one's identity. The first anniversary of the Horizons Foundation was celebrated not with a luxury gala, but a community event, held in the gymnasium of a public school in the Bronx, where 100 young scholarship recipients presented projects ranging from social tech apps to urban art initiatives. Ethan, standing at the back of the gym in jeans and a simple shirt, watching Lily on stage announcing the program's expansion to 5 new cities, felt something he had never experienced at any corporate dinner or investor conference. Pride detached from ego. The pure satisfaction of knowing his work was making lives better without demanding recognition or financial return. After the event, as they helped fold chairs and pack up equipment, Lily finally said the words Ethan didn't know he had been waiting for. "You know you don't have to prove anything anymore, right? You've already done the hard part. Now it's just living." And Ethan answered with a simple honesty that would have been impossible a year earlier. "I'm not trying to prove anything. For the first time in my life, I'm just trying to be enough. And maybe that's the only proof that matters." They walked together through the streets of the Bronx as the sun set over the city. Two people who had started at opposite ends of the social spectrum and had met in the one place where hierarchy didn't exist, on the common ground of shared humanity, where value is measured not in dollars or diplomas, but in the courage to acknowledge flaws, the humility to learn from those you've underestimated, and the quiet determination to wake up every day and choose to be better than you were yesterday. Not because someone is watching, but because you finally learned that the only audience that truly matters is the one you face in the mirror every morning. 2 years after that night at the Silver Crown, Ethan Cole stood in the small cafe he and Lily had opened together in Brooklyn, a space called Horizons Coffee, half coffee shop and half community center, where young students could work on laptops without pressure to buy more, where free coding and financial literacy classes were held 3 times a week, and where the aroma of fresh brewed coffee mingled with the sound of conversations about philosophy, technology, and social justice. The place wasn't profitable in the traditional sense. It barely covered operating costs. But it generated something infinitely more valuable: community, the kind of space where people from all walks of life met not as commercial transactions, but as human beings sharing a common ground of learning and connection. Ethan spent his mornings making coffee and talking with customers, many of whom had no idea that the man behind the counter had once commanded a multi-billion-dollar empire, and this invisibility was liberating in ways he had never anticipated, because for the first time in decades, people treated him based on how he treated them, not on how much money he had or what influence he wielded. Lily divided her time between managing the Horizons Foundation, which now operated in 12 American cities and had benefited over 2,000 young people with full scholarships, and completing her degree at Harvard, which she had resumed after Noah went into permanent remission and insisted that she couldn't spend her life taking care of him when she had so much potential to fulfill. Noah, now 18 and healthy, worked as an engineering intern at a biotech startup and visited the cafe regularly, not just out of gratitude to Ethan, but because he had developed a genuine affection for the man his sister had transformed through relentless truth and tough compassion. The story of Ethan and Lily had become known not through carefully managed public relations, but through an independent documentary a young filmmaker produced after discovering the narrative through articles about the fall of Cole Innovations and the rise of the Horizons Foundation. The film, titled simply The Price of Dignity, won awards at film festivals and sparked a national conversation about corporate ethics, personal redemption, and the difference between performative philanthropy and genuine transformation. Ethan watched the documentary only once, at its premiere in a small independent cinema in the East Village, and the experience of seeing his own arrogance displayed on the big screen, including footage from the original viral video at the restaurant, was both humbling and cathartic. A reminder that real growth requires continually confronting the version of yourself you are trying to overcome. Owen Parker eventually left Cole Innovations after the data scandal, taking with him a generous severance package, but a permanently tarnished reputation. In an unexpected encounter months later at a coffee shop in Midtown, he and Ethan spoke for the first time since the board meeting, and Owen admitted with a mixture of envy and respect, "You chose the harder path, and I still don't know if it was courage or madness. But watching you build something that actually matters while I'm still trying to convince investors I'm more than the CEO who sold user privacy for a quarterly bonus. It makes me question every choice I've made." Ethan replied without rancor, "It's never too late to choose differently, Owen. The door is always open. It just requires being willing to start from scratch and accept that success might not look anything like what we were taught to pursue." On a rainy afternoon in November, as Ethan was closing the cafe after a particularly busy day, Lily stayed behind to help him wipe down the tables, and in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over months of working side by side, she finally said something she had been holding back. "You know I've forgiven you, right? Not because you deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger is a weight neither of us needs. And more importantly, have you forgiven yourself?" Ethan stopped wiping, rested his hands on the table, and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I think I've accepted that the man I was existed, that he caused real harm, and that no amount of redemptive work can erase that. But I've also learned that identity isn't fixed. I can wake up every day and choose to be different. And maybe that's what matters. Not erasing the past, but refusing to let it define the future. Lily smiled, that rare, genuine smile that lit up her face and reminded Ethan why he had crossed an emotional desert to get to this moment. That's the smartest answer you've ever given me. Congratulations, Mr. Cole. You finally learned the lesson. They locked up the cafe and walked together down the wet street, past neighborhood shops and ethnic restaurants where families ate at close tables. And Ethan realized that at some point over the last 2 years, he had stopped measuring his days in terms of productivity or profit and started measuring them in moments of human connection, meaningful conversations, problem solved, lives positively impacted. As they reached the corner where their paths diverged, Lily heading to the apartment she now shared with Noah in a renovated building 3 blocks away, Ethan returning to his modest space in the opposite direction, she turned and briefly held his hand, a simple but meaning-laden gesture. "Thank you for letting me teach you," she said, "and thank you for having the courage to learn." Ethan squeezed her hand in return, and in the words he spoke next, he carried all the gratitude and transformation of a journey that began with humiliation and ended with reclaimed humanity. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I wasn't worth it yet. Thank you for showing me that real power isn't in dominating people, but in serving them. And thank you for proving that the waitress I underestimated was the teacher I needed to find." They parted, each going their own way through the Brooklyn streets under a light rain that washed the city clean. And as Ethan walked, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before he built his empire. A simple, profound peace. The knowledge that he had finally understood the only lesson that truly mattered. That true human worth was never in the things we accumulate or the titles we hold, but in the courage to acknowledge our mistakes, the humility to learn from those we underestimate, and the quiet determination to wake up every day and choose dignity over dominance, connection over control, and love over profit. Because in the end, the only empire worth building is one made of authentic relationships, meaningful purpose, and the ability to look in the mirror and recognize not a billionaire or a corporate title, but simply a human being trying to do better, one day at a time. If this story of transformation, redemption, and reclaimed dignity touched your heart, don't keep this lesson to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that it's never too late to start over, that true power lies in serving, not dominating, and that the people we underestimate can be the very teachers we need to find. Leave a like if you believe that real change begins with the courage to acknowledge our mistakes. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and transform the way we see success and human value. And in the comments, tell us your own story. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged you by your appearance or social position? Or have you been the person who had to learn humility the hard way? Your words can inspire thousands of people who are struggling with the same questions, because in the end, we are all on journeys of growth. And sharing our experiences is how we transform individual lessons into collective wisdom that can change the world, one life at a time.